Happy Rare Disease Day, everyone. I'm very happy the Federation decided to bring us all together. I have to remember to speak slow for the translator. Hello, everybody who doesn't speak English. My name is Ana Mingorance. I'm an independent professional dedicated to therapy development for syndromes that have epilepsy, including Dravet syndrome. And that is why I was asked to talk to you today about the clinical trials that are coming up for Dravet. A disclaimer, I have worked or still work with many of the companies that are developing the drugs that I will tell you about. Yeah. So how we got to where we are today with clinical trials for Dravet syndrome? We got here starting by looking at Dravet as an epilepsy syndrome. And what I mean by this is that I think most of you online are families. You look at your children, there is a lot more than epilepsy. It is a very complex disease of brain development and it has epilepsy. But all of the first clinical trials were for Dravet as a type of epilepsy. And for the first 25 years after Dravet syndrome was discovered by Dr. Dravet in 1978, we had to wait nearly 30 years to have the first drug approved that was a drug for epilepsy in Dravet syndrome. And it's a drug that had 2 very small clinical trials, which means that for most families in Europe, you could never have an opportunity to get your children into a clinical trial. That drug was tiripentol. After that, we founded the Dravet Syndrome European Federation. At the beginning, it was a small group. I was part of that, so I'm happy we founded the federation. And it's around this time, 2014, that suddenly we started having a lot more clinical trials. And it's around that time that we had cannabidiol and fenfluramine in clinical trials in Europe. I'm sure that some of you at the other side of the camera have had your kids, children, adults in these clinical trials with cannabidiol or fenfluramine, and finally we had approvals. This doesn't look like a lot, but I want to be clear, this was a big thing because right now, in general, people with Dravet syndrome have less seizures than before we had this drug, so they're all doing better. Also, for the first time for me, I started knowing patients that were seizure-free, without seizures, with Dravet syndrome. I didn't know any before. And now we finally had some lucky people that were without seizures, maybe not forever, but maybe for 4 years. And then we got the news more recently that thanks to these new medicines, the percentage of cases with SUDEP, with death because of Dravet syndrome, was much lower than before. So this was already very good. And somehow, because of those trials that were also good for us, the disease became famous. And suddenly Dravet was not another epilepsy. It was like the most famous epilepsy. And you should see that in all of the medical conference and biotech conference. Dravet syndrome was very, very famous. And that got us to today. This is a map of all of the programs, therapeutic programs in development for Dravet. From earlier stage, moving towards the center is closer to approved that are in development for Dravet syndrome. And it's about 30 different programs. Every company wants to do some therapy for Dravet. And now we have the first generation of treatments that are drugs that all work differently. A second generation in orange, which I call them second generation because they're doing the same as the first ones, but better. These are the follow-up treatments. And then at the bottom in yellow, you can see the treatments that go after the cause of the disease. Because Dravet syndrome, for most of the patients, is caused by the same gene, SCN1A, slow for the automatic translator, SCN1A. So these are directed to correcting that cause. We got famous. We had many programs. And we also had some bad news for the first time, which I think this one was very important at the end of last year. The first phase 3 trial, global trial, that was in many countries in Europe that failed. I write failure within quotation marks because the drug didn't really fail, but efficacy was a bit too small for the trial to get the math right. So it didn't pass the criteria to be approved. That was sad. At the same time, we also had good news, like one of those first generation that I was telling you, this is a follow-up to fenfluramine, the drug that is approved, is coming to clinical trials in Europe in a global trial this year. So some bad news and some good news. I'll tell you a bit more about this one later. And where are we today? If we zoom out and look at all of the programs, I think that where we are right now in 2025 is in a very important before and after moment for developing therapies for Dravet and for running clinical trials for Dravet. Because until now, I told you we were looking at Dravet syndrome as an epilepsy syndrome. Finally, in clinical trials, we are looking at Dravet syndrome as a neurodevelopmental disease, very complex, with motor, cognitive, behavior, seizures, all of it. So this is a before and after in how we run clinical trials. And it is a before and after in the type of drug that we're using. Because before we were having medicines for the epilepsy, and now we have the first therapies for the cause, for the gene that is the cause of Dravet for most of the patients, some don't. And the pioneer for this, and I'm sure you all have heard about this company, is Stoke Therapeutics, that design a therapy that is like a little piece of DNA that allows your body to increase the expression of the sodium channel. And they had to essentially redefine Dravet syndrome for regulators and for trials from epilepsy to neurodevelopmental. And that was difficult because they had to figure out a completely new way of running clinical trials. And this year is important because it's when this drug is moving to phase 3 and therefore reaching global trials. So for us in Europe, and today this is the European Federation, finally we are going to get the clinical trial of the treatment for the cause of the disease. Big, big, big news. A little bit about what we know about this therapy, this little piece of DNA that is injected into the using spinal tap. So we know that in phase 2 trials, those are the ones before the global trials, when using the dose that will be used for the phase 3, this therapy was able to reduce seizures and improve cognition, behavior, and motor skills. There was a video that the company showed to all of us, not the company, one of the clinicians showed to all of us 2 months ago. Really, really beautiful before and after in a patient. And you can see for that patient, she's a girl, she's 12 and then 13, how she could write the numbers and how much, well, numbers and words, how much that improved with the treatment. What I want to highlight here is this is exactly what you would expect to see when you are treating the cause of the disease. All of the disease should get better. It's not a treatment for one symptom. And sometimes with the epilepsy drugs, we see a bit of improvement in behavior, in cognition, but this is different. This is much different. This is much stronger because this therapy and the ones that come behind it are treating the cause. And importantly, as I was telling you, this therapy is now coming to Europe for clinical trials, still, but big trials. It will be in the US, UK, but also Europe and Japan. There will be a control group. That's when the kids don't receive the treatment, but we still watch and see how they improve or don't improve. And the timelines that we know is that the trial is starting before the summer in the US, in America, but we still don't know. In Europe will be later. The other countries are later. So we will get more news of when it's starting, but it's very important. Also, recently, Stoke partnered with a big company called Biogen, very important company in the field of neurology. So in Europe, it will maybe be Biogen, the one that we hear about, but this is important. The big companies are seeing how important is Dravet syndrome, how important is this treatment, and they're partnering with Stoke. This is really good. And one thing I wanted to say, for me, the phase 2 data, the data from the Stoke treatment that I told you, it's important not only because of that treatment, but because what we learn about what the body can do and a body with Dravet syndrome, what it can do. Because we knew already from the mice that have Dravet that we make them by mutating the same gene, that in a mouse, it is never too late to give them the gene back and see the mouse get a lot better. But a mouse is a mouse. And a mouse can get old with Dravet, and you could still get them much better if you treat them as an adult. But we did not know in humans. And thanks to this first trial, now we know in humans, they had children up to age 17, that they can all get better, that they can see improvements, not only in epilepsy, but in cognition, in behavior, in motor, like that girl that was writing. And I hope that this tells us that it's also never too late. And this is very important also for the programs that follow. And talking about programs that follow, because it's not just the one from Stoke that we have, I wanted to highlight this one. It's called ETX 101. I hope they will come up with a nicer name. It is from a company called Encoded Therapeutics, and this is a gene therapy of the type that uses a virus. So this is one injection of one virus that has inside the instructions for the body to move up the expression of the good gene. And they're going into trials for very, very young children, as young as 6 months of age. And these are already starting the trials. It's not in Europe yet, but as young as 6 months. And this is for me very special because it makes me think that there might be already somewhere in the world, in Australia, UK, in America, a little child that has received this gene therapy, that was born with Dravet syndrome, and that will not develop all the bad part of Dravet syndrome. Hopefully they will have only a very mild Dravet syndrome. Maybe they will be almost as if they had nothing. We don't know, but that first human that got a gene therapy when he or she was very, very young might already exist. So this makes, as I'm telling you, this year, a wonderful year. Stoke will give data. Stoke will start trials in Europe in the world this year, maybe in Europe later this year, next year. Encoded the gene therapy. We will know if it is looking good later this year also. So this is a very important year for Dravet syndrome. And where are we going next? I'm again assuming that most of you are families in Europe. What we have next this year in Europe will be 2 trials, global, large phase 3 trials. One is the drug called bexicaserin. It is the follow-up fenfluramine. It's like a second generation fenfluramine. We can call it a second generation fenfluramine for children age 2 to adults, all adults, and you don't need to have a CN1A mutation, the gene mutation. You just need to be Dravet syndrome. That's a clinical diagnosis. The other one, and that's, by the way, for epilepsy. The other one is this piece of DNA that is administered every 4 months, that is almost like a gene therapy, that had the very good data in the first trials. And that trial is also coming to Europe. The ages are shorter, is 2 to 17. So if your child is an adult, they are not eligible for this one. And it also needs them to have the gene mutation, because of the way the therapy works is for the mutation, is to increase expression from the good copy, but it has to be the gene, it has to be this gene. But we will have those 2 options. And I look forward to seeing ideally hundreds of families in Europe having access to these new clinical trials. From the future, I wanted to tell you about 2 programs. They are not yet in trials. I look forward to clinical trials. I find them very exciting. One is another gene therapy of the one that uses a virus, but is only for people that have a mutation that is nonsense, a stop mutation. You might have heard the stop mutation. This is for stop mutations. And I like that this therapy is being developed in a company that is made by 2 parents. They have daughters with Dravet syndrome because of stop mutations. The other one is a medicine that works like a normal medicine, that you have a liquid or a pill and you take it. I think it will be liquid, by a company called Xenon. So this is not a gene therapy. This is a drug that can open the sodium channel so that you, if you have Dravet syndrome, now you have as much function as you need. And this is because it's not a gene therapy, but it's a normal medicine. It will be able to be given on top of the other treatments. So your kid could have a gene therapy and this medicine, or the treatment from Stoke and this medicine. And I'm very excited about this one, not in clinical trials yet. This is the future. And I will leave you with this slide about the future. The future of running clinical trials with treatments for epilepsy is now, well, the present is running clinical trials in Dravet with treatments for the cause. So in a way, that future is now, we're just starting, and I think it will go really well, but I look forward to the questions later.